But the people eliminated are Felipe Massa, Nico Hulkenberg, Stoffel Van Dorn, Romain Grosjean, and strangely Esteban Ocon, who's a Grand Prix winner. Esteban Ocon was the slowest in qualifying. Magnussen looks like he's just going to be eliminated, but 11th place is quite a decent qualifying position because you don't get the negative benefit or the negative influence of getting into Q3. The 2017 German Grand Prix is underway. He started in 11th and already he's in 5th place down into 6th, but he's going to thread it between a couple of drivers there. Kevin Magnussen, what a phenomenal start. He was up into 5th place, now in 6th. Well, Jolyon Palmer crashed in the previous Grand Prix, and now Hulkenberg, he's crashed in this one. Oh, well, look at that. Kevin Magnussen has just passed Max Verstappen. That even though we're going to do an extra lap, maybe an extra 2 laps than the front runners, if they're pitting onto the hards, we may as well do the same thing. So Magnussen, he's come out right in between Kimi Raikkonen and Lewis Hamilton. Sebastian Vettel is sort of the race leader. He's in 4th place, but if you look, he's got, well, his hard tyres are way more worn than Ricciardo's, than Hamilton's, Raikkonen's, Verstappen's, Magnussen's. We've done the same strategy as Valtteri Bottas in the Mercedes, and we're ahead of him. Jolyon Palmer has set the fastest lap of the Grand Prix. Well, it is all kicking off. But Daniel Ricciardo is going to win the 2017 German Grand Prix, 4.3 seconds ahead of Lewis Hamilton in 2nd, and his teammate Max Verstappen in 3rd. Kimi Raikkonen's in 4th, and Kevin Magnussen is in 5th. I believe that's Kevin Magnussen's best finish this season, and in fact also the best finish that we've had this series in dry conditions. Right then guys, it's PSL here, and today I'm going to wrap up my Equal Cars Formula 1 Championship on Motorsport Manager. I will summarise the second half of the season all in one video, as to be perfectly honest, this series didn't go down quite as well as I hoped or even expected, but I still want to finish the series, so I'm going to do it in the most time effective way possible. Just to remind you, at the halfway mark of the season, Sebastian Vettel is leading the Drivers' Championship by 3 points ahead of Lewis Hamilton in 2nd. Following them, it's Ricciardo in 3rd, and then both Force India drivers, with Raikkonen in 7th, and Valtteri Bottas, who's been very disappointing this season so far, all the way down in 15th in the Drivers' Championship. In the Constructors' Championship, Ferrari are leading the way by a good 28 points ahead of Mercedes in 2nd. Red Bull and Force India aren't too far behind, then it's Williams and McLaren who are separated by only 6 points. If you go down another 13 points, you then get to Toro Rosso, who are ahead of the team I'm managing, Haas, by only 4 points. Renault are 30 points behind Haas in 2nd to last, and the corporate giant of Renault are only 3 points ahead of Sauber. Just before we head into the next race of the season, I should point out that this game was updated substantially between the last race I did and this one. For example, I was now able to toggle between normal and realistic race strategies for the AI. So I set it to realistic race strategies to make the game more difficult and maybe a touch more realistic. The first Grand Prix in this video is the 9th one in the season, the British Grand Prix. Another part of the game's update was the weight stripping feature, where you can reduce the car's reliability in return for some extra performance. So just before qualifying, I reduced the car's overall reliability by 25% in exchange for 450 extra performance on both of my cars. The weight stripping certainly worked, as it got both Magnussen and Grosjean into Q3, which is very rare for us. In fact, prior to this, Grosjean kept qualifying in and around last place. So since we got into Q3, that's meant that both McLaren drivers found themselves in the drop zone at the end of Q2 instead, and in the end both of our drivers qualified in 8th and 9th place. But as we know, if you make it into Q3, you have to start on the tyres you used in Q2. That meant that we had to start on tyres which had no life left in them. So Grosjean had to pit at the end of the first lap of the Grand Prix, and Magnussen came in at the end of the second lap. At the end of the 11th lap, Vettel pitted in from 2nd place, having already pitted in once this race to fit on the super softs. This meant that Vettel lost the effective race lead to Lewis Hamilton, as the one stop that Hamilton did was much better than the 2 stop carried out by Vettel. in the end, Lewis Hamilton won his home Grand Prix with Daniel Ricciardo in second and Sergio Perez in third. Jolyon Palmer did phenomenally well to finish 4th at his home Grand Prix, and this is just the start of Renault's decent form, because trust me, for a team which is currently second to last in the team's championship, they do remarkably well in the second half of this season. Sebastian Vettel, thanks to his two-stop strategy, didn't even score any points this Grand Prix, and in fact Romain Grosjean did quite well considering he had to do a two-stop strategy this Grand Prix with the state of his starting tyres. This means that Romain Grosjean was second of the two-stoppers, which I can take some pride in considering I was basically forced to stop twice this Grand Prix. All of that means that in the Drivers' Championship, Vettel has gone from a 3-point lead to a 22-point deficit to Lewis Hamilton. Next up is the Belgian Grand Prix, and this time I decided to only strip off 20% of the car's reliability, so I only gained 360 performance, but it was for the best as I started to get issues with my cars at the end of the previous Grand Prix. As such, we didn't do quite as well in qualifying this time around, as Romain Grosjean qualified in 12th, whilst Magnussen finished in 7th. Into the race now, and at the end of the third lap, Magnussen had to come into the pits, thanks to him making it into Q3. Everyone did a one-stop strategy, which meant that Magnussen nearly scored a point, but Grosjean did, and that was only due to the fact that Bottas was going very slowly at the end of the race due to a mechanical issue. Vettel won the race with Hamilton in second, and impressively Nico Hülkenberg finished in third. Also a shout out to Pascal Wehrlein who finished the race in 9th place in a Sauber of all cars. Unfortunately for Haas, because Hülkenberg got a podium finish and even Palmer finished in 6th, Renault overtook Haas and Toro Rosso all in one go in the team's championship. Afterwards it was the 11th round of the season in Italy, and the competitive part of the weekend started off with Kevin Magnussen qualifying in last place. Grosjean made it through into Q3, beating Palmer and Sainz, although Sainz did have to qualify on a worn set of soft tyres. Meanwhile, it's a Ferrari front row with a Mercedes second row. A good start to the Grand Prix meant that Grosjean worked his way up into 4th place once the rain started falling. Not only that, but because Vettel and Hamilton were the last to fit on the intermediate tyres, that meant they lost out hugely to Grosjean, who was able to retain 4th place. Later on in the Grand Prix, and on the contrary to his earlier strategy, Lewis Hamilton was the first person to fit on the slick tyres when it started to dry up again. A mistake in the pits cost Magnussen any chance of scoring a decent points finish. Thankfully, when Grosjean came into the pits from a temporary first place, there was no issue with his pit stop, which meant he was able to leave the pits in 5th place. Staggeringly, Nico Hülkenberg for Renault won the Grand Prix. Again, let me just remind you that prior to this video, Renault were nowhere near being able to win races. Fernando Alonso took 2nd with Kimi Raikkonen in 3rd, Lewis Hamilton finished in 4th, and Romain Grosjean took an impressive 5th place finish. Sebastian Vettel once again missed out on points as he finished down in 12th. In the Drivers' Championship, Alonso and Hülkenberg, thanks to them taking the top 2 positions this Grand Prix, were able to rocket up the Drivers' Championship to 6th and 7th respectively. Meanwhile, in the Teams' Championship, Haas overtook Toro Rosso to reclaim 8th in the standings. Next up is round 12 in Singapore, which started off with a Q1 session which amazingly saw both Haas drivers in 3rd and 4th. But as we know, the session that determines those grid positions is Q3. Speaking of which, despite Q3 being only 10 minutes long, it saw a complete change in weather and track conditions, and also a complete change in position for Max Verstappen, who was the fastest in wet conditions but the slowest in dry conditions. Kevin Magnussen finished in 9th and Romain Grosjean finished in 5th. Unsurprisingly, our qualifying success had a price to pay, and that is extremely worn starting tyres, meaning that both of our guys had to come into the pits almost immediately. Grosjean had to come into the pits at the end of the first lap. In fact, tyre wear was so bad for Grosjean that he had to fit on the intermediate tyres when the track was still dry. However, I wasn't going mad because rain was due imminently. That wasn't the end of Grosjean's troubles, as he had to come into the pits for a second set of intermediate tyres, as his first ones wore out so quickly. We did get some luck, as in the final few laps of the Grand Prix, the track dried up and we were one of the few teams to fit on the dry tyres. Very few other drivers took that initiative, which is unlucky for them as our drivers moved up from 14th and 15th to 7th for Grosjean and 9th for Magnussen come the end of the Grand Prix, with Max Verstappen separating our two drivers as he also fitted on the super soft tyres. However, our success was overshadowed by the fact that Nico Hülkenberg won the Grand Prix, his second race win in a row. The results of that Grand Prix meant that Nico Hülkenberg moved up to 4th in the Drivers' Championship. To put that achievement in context, at the halfway mark of the season, which was only 4 races ago, Hülkenberg was 17th in the Drivers' Championship. So that means that Nico Hülkenberg has moved up 13 positions in the Drivers' Championship in 4 Grand Prix. It's also worth noting that post the Singapore Grand Prix, Kimi Raikkonen overtook Massa and Alonso for 6th place. We're now on to the final 4 races of the season, which starts with the Japanese Grand Prix. Qualifying for the race was pretty boring. Magnussen qualified in 12th, along with the usual people who get eliminated in Q2, with the possible exception of Max Verstappen, who normally makes it into Q3. Romain Grosjean impressively qualified in 4th place, and was only beaten by Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel, in other words, the 2 Drivers' Championship contenders, and the recent sensation Nico Hülkenberg. Unfortunately, that qualifying pace didn't turn into much in the race, and that's despite the fact that Romain Grosjean unlocked the light-footed super soft tyres perk, which was only gained because I changed the engineers that we had earlier on in the season, and the engineers that I employed early on had these perks. You had to unlock them, but thankfully Romain Grosjean has just unlocked his. The light-footed perk didn't stop Grosjean being forced to come into the pit before everyone else, with the exception of Jolyon Palmer, who came in on the same lap. Magnussen was the only driver to start the race on the medium tyres, as he tried to not have to stop at all before the rain came in later into the race. It didn't work. The rain fell and we weren't able to capitalise on it. Magnussen was the last to pit onto the intermediate tyres as he came out in 10th and just behind his teammate. Grosjean wasn't able to, but Magnussen did gain late on into the race as he was able to work his way up into 8th place, but was oh so close to 6th. Grosjean meanwhile fell to 12th. Meanwhile, Sebastian Vettel won the Grand Prix, with Max Verstappen in 2nd and Fernando Alonso in 3rd. The championship leader Lewis Hamilton was in 4th, and he just about beats the recently unbelievably good Nico Hülkenberg. Hopping continents now from Asia to North America for the United States of America Grand Prix. Let's head straight into Q3, as nothing really interesting happened in the other rounds. Well, Alonso got knocked out in Q2, but that's it. Anyway, Q3 ended predictably with Vettel and Hamilton as the top 2. Hülkenberg once again was in 3rd place, showing his newfound form wasn't just temporary, but was permanent and real. Grosjean qualified in 6th and Magnussen in 7th, although Max Verstappen we beat purely because he ran out of brand new soft tyres by this point. Just before this race, Kevin Magnussen unlocked his own light-footed perk, which conveniently was for the medium tyres. That didn't do him any good at the start, as he had to pit from his worn softs at the end of the first lap. His teammate followed suit a lap later. The race was pretty boring from Haas's perspective. Grosjean was just about in 10th before he had to pit in for a second time, and a mistake by the pit crew put the final nail in the coffin. Sebastian Vettel won this dreary American Grand Prix, with Daniel Kvyat impressively in 2nd, Van Dorn, Verline and Stroll all impressed to take 5th, 6th and 7th respectively, with Lewis Hamilton all the way down in 10th thanks to his 2-stop strategy. The race strategy screen says it all. Stopping twice was a guarantee of a poor result. Raikkonen and Hamilton were the only drivers who stopped twice to score points. As per usual, because we made it into Q3, we had to start on some extremely worn tyres. That's meant that we had to stop twice, which made it near impossible for us to score points. Vettel and Hamilton finishing at opposite ends of the points positions means that Vettel retook the lead of the Drivers' Championship by 7 points. Meanwhile, Max Verstappen, who is generally disappointed in this series, has finally been able to get some decent finishes under his belt and move himself up to 7th place in the Drivers' Championship. So now it's on to the penultimate race of the season, the Brazilian Grand Prix. Kevin Magnussen performed very well in Q1, taking 3rd place, but as always, once we get into Q3, we don't do quite as well. Grosjean qualified in 6th and Magnussen qualified in 7th. meaning that Haas as a team outqualified Red Bull, as Daniel Ricciardo finished in 8th and Max Verstappen in 9th. Fortunately, the race was quite exciting, and it was exciting right from the get-go, as everyone elected to start on the intermediate tyres, despite the fact that the track was dry and it didn't even start raining until the middle of the second lap. Romain Grosjean quickly ended up in 4th place and was leading a train of cars. That's why I decided to bring in Magnussen first, hoping he could undercut those in the train led by Grosjean. It worked initially, despite the fact our guys were the first to come into the pits, with the exception of, as always, Jolyon Palmer, who came in on the same lap as Kevin Magnussen. Things slowly started to unravel as many people were fitting on the slick tyres just after we had fitted on the second set of intermediate tyres. This included Hulkenberg, who came in and braved it out on dry tyres when he was leading the race. Eventually we caved in and we were the last to fit on the dry tyres. We double stacked our drivers, destroying Grosjean's race, and whilst Magnussen did well to move up from 15th to 12th, it wasn't good enough to score points. Nico Hulkenberg, again with another amazing performance, split the two championship contenders as Lewis Hamilton won the Grand Prix and Sebastian Vettel finished in 3rd. Carlos Sainz did well to finish in 7th, while Sergio Perez for Force India beat Kimi Raikkonen to take 5th. Unsurprisingly, the undoubtedly phenomenal Fernando Alonso came in 4th. This race's result means that with just one race left to go in the season, it's all to play for, as Lewis Hamilton retook the lead of the Drivers' Championship by 3 points. Meanwhile, Ferrari, who lead the Constructors' Championship by 48 points, have now sealed it, as no team can possibly catch them with just one Grand Prix left to go. Speaking of which, the final Grand Prix of the 2017 Equal Formula 1 Cars Championship was hosted by Doha in Qatar, and I'll tell you what, considering it's the final race of the season and the fact that this country is responsible for hosting a future World Cup, this race was pretty dull. The Q1 eliminations were the same as always, Force India's, Williams and a couple of others being knocked out as always. Q2 again was fairly standard, with the possible exception of Max Verstappen being knocked out, although that is semi-regular at this point. And finally, even Q3 was somewhat normal, with Sebastian Vettel taking pole position for the Qatari Grand Prix, with Kimi Raikkonen joining him on the front row. Hamilton qualified down in 6th, behind both Hulkenberg and Magnussen. The only slight surprises were that Ricciardo finished down in 9th, and Fernando Alonso, was the slowest that session. As always, we had to start the race on some worn as hell soft tyres, meaning once again we were essentially penalised for making it into Q3. Kevin Magnussen's light-footed medium tyres perk helped a bit, but it didn't stop our drivers being two of the very few to have to stop twice that race. Although annoyingly, I can't really blame the two-stop strategy on this occasion, as Sebastian Vettel stopped twice himself, and sure, he had a 15-second lead ahead of Daniel Ricciardo when he stopped second time around, but he still stopped twice and led the entire Grand Prix. Kevin Magnussen oh so nearly passed Daniel Kvyat to snatch a point from the Qatari Grand Prix, but he didn't quite do it as he finished just behind the Russian, and impressively also just behind the sublime Nico Hulkenberg. But all eyes were on Sebastian Vettel, as he, in dominant fashion, won the Qatari Grand Prix and along with it, the 2017 Equal Cars Formula 1 Drivers' Championship. I don't think there's really any arguing with that, and in fact he was realistically one of 3 drivers who was likely to win this championship, or certainly one of 3 drivers who I had my money on to win the Drivers' Championship. Lewis Hamilton was only 7 points behind in the end, but was still a good 53 points ahead of the best of the rest, who was Daniel Ricciardo. For me, Nico Hulkenberg was the surprise of the season in 4th in the Drivers' Championship, even though, as I said earlier on, come the end of the first half of the season, he was 17th in the Drivers' Championship. Sergio Perez did exceedingly well to finish the season in 5th, ahead of Fernando Alonso, Kimi Raikkonen and Max Verstappen. The big underperformer for me is Valtteri Bottas. He had one of the slightly better cars, but still finished down in 15th place in the Drivers' Championship, with 189 points less than his teammate Lewis Hamilton. Bottas's poor performance at least compared to Ferrari's number 2 driver Kimi Raikkonen, means that Mercedes lost out on the team's championship by quite a margin. Ferrari won the team's championship by 66 points over Mercedes and 69 over Red Bull, meaning Mercedes only just about beat Red Bull by 3 points over the course of the entire season. Following them, it's Force India, Renault, McLaren, Williams, Toro Rosso. Then below the triple digit mark is Haas, my team embarrassingly in second to last in the championship on 77 points, but we still comfortably beat Sauber, who only amassed 33 points all season. So overall, have these equal cars rules shaken up F1's pecking order? Honestly, no. Sure, there are a few drivers who did much better or worse than others, and we had the likes of Esteban Ocon and Nico Hülkenberg winning races, but generally speaking, the team's pecking order remains the same. Sure, the field was much closer. I mean, the team finishing in last in the team's championship, still scoring 33 points, is unprecedented. But apart from McLaren finishing 6th, I would say nothing massively unorthodox ended up happening in the team's championship. And from my personal perspective, I took the team that, according to the game's rating, with the equal F1 cars rules applied, is what? The 9th best team? Joint second worst? Joint worst? Either way, I took that team that was meant to finish towards the back, and we ended up finishing towards the back of the team's championship with them. I mean, I hope you guys enjoyed it for what it was, but we hardly shook up the results that you would normally see currently in Formula 1. We had a few shock results and the field closed up, but generally speaking, the sport's pecking order remains relatively untouched.